So wetlands come in various types of situations with respect to the, it could be flowing water, it could be static water. The water could be permanent throughout the year, it could be seasonal. It typically will have some vegetation aspects related to it. It could be a swamp or a marshland, a fen or a bog. These are all different types of vegetation water combinations. It also has the water table very high and often saturated soil surrounding the wetland area. And there is also variability from year to year because depending on the type of water inflow and outflow and the rainfall in the area and the topography. So wetlands come in various shapes and sizes, and also in terms of whether it's fresh water, brackish water, or saline water. So they range all the way from, even human-made wetlands. Wetlands, for example, behind barrages are formed because of hydrologic modifications, and all the way up to mangrove swamps, and so it's urban lakes. So it's basically a large number of types of vegetation, water, soil combinations, also in terms of the depth of water throughout the year, or whether it's seasonal or throughout, or it's throughout the year, and so on. So these are all different aspects, and they they're located all over the country and all over the world. Wetlands are very important because of the ecosystem services that they provide to human communities. They also support a lot of biodiversity and livelihoods of people. So whether it's fishing or water for irrigation or extraction of biomass from the wetlands, they provide an important role in improving the quality of water and by absorbing and assimilating contaminants and pollutants. They store a lot of carbon, and they are also very important for recreation as well. So if you look at the functions and ecosystem services provided by wetlands to all of us, they are actually one of the most important ecosystems that we need to think about. Wetland conservation requires a variety of approaches. Of course, you need strong legislative support from the state, from the government. You also need support from citizens who are stakeholders in the conservation and management of these wetlands. And we need partnerships between different stakeholders and citizens, whether it's in an urban context of the lakes that we have in Bengaluru, or whether it's irrigation tanks, which also serve as important refuges for biodiversity, or especially waterfowl, or mangrove swamps and saline mud flats and many other areas that are really important. So it requires support from the top in terms of legislation. It also needs supportive policies to ensure that the ecosystem services of wetlands are recognized and they're included in the spatial zoning and planning of the land use, so that land uses that are not conducive for the maintenance of the attributes of the wetland are not encouraged. And in fact, we go in for a wetland friendly development model, both in urban spaces, peri-urban spaces, rural areas, as well as in other parts of the country. Wetlands which do not come under the official definition of less than a particular number of hectares, these are clusters of ponds. So in many parts of the country, you don't have one single large wetland that would attract a lot of attention and would have a high profile. Those generally tend to get a lot more attention from civil society and government and communities. But we also have ponds, small ponds, but they occur in large clusters. And there's movement of biodiversity between those ponds, especially waterfowl. There is hydrologic exchange between them as well. And since each of those ponds individually doesn't qualify as a protected wetland under different categories of the law or of regulations, they often don't get state protection. But as a cluster, if we lose them, we are losing we are losing a lot of biodiversity and ecosystem services, which should be equivalent to a fairly large wetland. So I think that these clusters of ponds are the ones which are most vulnerable, and that's one example of a wetland system that I think is particularly threatened. The Yamuna is one of the most polluted rivers when it flows through Delhi, and the floodplains have also been contaminated for decades because of dumping of garbage, of pollution of the soil, of the water, the air, and also the chemicals that come out of an urban industrial land use. And now there have been attempts to actually have constructed or designed wetlands or restore wetlands. The Yamuna Biodiversity Park is an example. There are other biodiversity parks that are being planned in the Yamuna floodplain. And there is also debate about whether the agriculture in the Yamuna floodplain, whether a sustainable form of that with less chemical use can be allowed to flourish along with these wetlands. And so I think that if we are able to do that, that is, you can sustain livelihoods around less chemical intensive agriculture in the Yamuna floodplains, along with these biodiversity parks that are being set up. Over a period of time, I would say that would be a very important success story from a situation of despair and doom to something that we can look forward to. So India is a rapidly urbanizing country. I think we are already well past 30%, and then we are going to have more areas in the country which are going to be either urban or peri-urban. And wetlands may very well become a victim of the development pathways that we choose. So we have to be very careful, because whether it's urban planning or any other type of land use zoning, wetlands need to be kept in mind. And because there's a real threat of real estate diversion, and it's very difficult for, even with our knowledge of how important wetlands are, it's becoming increasingly difficult to compete against the huge profits that can be made by diverting wetland areas to other types of land use, especially real estate development or commercial development. So we really need to be careful about that. And in fact, in our definition of smart cities, the conservation and protection of wetland systems should be part of the definition of a smart city. So that's something that I think perhaps will help us keep these wetlands. We have a limited window of opportunity in terms of data collection. We may not have secondary data on the hydrology or the ecology of the wetland. Of course, we can use remotely sensed time series imageries to understand how it has been shrinking and swelling or changing over the last couple of decades and so on. But in the absence of instrumentation or of long-term data, the only source of information and knowledge that we have on the complex changes that have been occurring in the wetland is from local people who have been using the wetland for a long time or who are very knowledgeable. And I think there is no substitute for that. So scientific monitoring can be for a limited period of time, because in India, we generally don't have long-term monitoring systems in place. And therefore, we have to rely on the knowledge of local communities, and especially people who have been known to familiar with that wetland for a long period of time. And they're a treasure trove of information on various aspects, whether it's biodiversity or whether it's the type of vegetation that used to be there in the wetland, or what types of changes have occurred, what happens during a drought year, what happens during a high rainfall year, was it connected to a particular river or not, what's been happening to the cropland around the wetland, and so on. So these are all things that we can only learn from local community knowledge. So hydrology is actually integral to the whole wetland definition and system. So both groundwater and fresh water and surface water contribute to the maintenance of a wetland, not just the actual body of water under varying depths, but also the saturation levels or soil moisture levels in the area surrounding the wetland, which also supports vegetation of various kinds. So it's a combination of the actual water spread as well as the vegetation and soils around it. How wet that is or how dry it gets is basically a function of the hydrology, whether it's the rainfall falling in that area or whether it's the inflow of groundwater that sustains the wetland, or in many cases it's the replenishment of the water in the wetland from flooding events in nearby rivers, or water that's coming in as an inflow into the wetland from upstream. So basically hydrology is in some sense the heart and soul. It's very much it determines everything that a wetland is all about. So I would say that this it's probably the hydrology and ecology together are the two areas that we really need to understand in order to manage a wetland. As citizens, I think we can raise awareness amongst ourselves, work with any government bodies that have been empowered to look after these wetlands, mobilize information and knowledge. And I think citizen action can also help improve the quality of governance, because we can ensure accountability from those who have the responsibility to look after the wetlands. We also need to be thinking about our own actions in terms of how we use resources or how we contribute to the threats to the wetland, whether it's solid waste disposal, whether it's a lack of recycling, or any other types of activities in and around these wetlands that might be either contaminating it or reducing the amount of water that goes into it or pollutes it. So these are things that are within our means to at least be a watchdog and also help put pressure on our civic authorities who are empowered to look after this.